Afternoon. Please take a seat. And so let me introduce myself and the center first. I'm Julia Lee. I'm an assistant professor of management and organizations here at Ross School of Business. Let me also introduce the Center for Positive Organizations. We are a community of students, of practitioners, and of faculty who are trying to push the frontier to understand what cultivates flourishing and thriving in individuals and organizations. And today's talk is very fitting, considering that mission of our center. But let me ask you a quick question first. How many of you are here for the very first time? So raise your hand if you're first-time attendees. Wow, almost more than half of you are first-time attendees. That's wonderful. I think that's a great testament to how many people wanted to see and meet Teresa in person. So that's wonderful. Please make a habit of joining us for this speaker series for the rest of the year. Before I introduce our wonderful speaker, Teresa Amabile, I would also like to thank our sponsors. So first of all, Diane and Paul Johns, who's sitting in the first row, have been generously sponsoring this speaker series since its very beginning. So please give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being part of this wonderful journey. And in addition, I would like to thank University of Michigan Organizational Learning, Zanger Leadership Center, Tower Institute for Global Operations, Zell and Drury Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies, and Lisa and David Drews. Okay. Now, it is my great honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Teresa Amabile. She's the Edsel Bryan Ford Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. She is most well known for her research on creativity, productivity, innovation, and inner work life, and the confluence of emotions, perceptions, and motivation that people experience as they react to events at work. So as you can see, she's known for the depth and breadth of her research, and she's also a fantastic person and a scholar I grew up admiring as a graduate student. So I'm very excited to have her here today. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Teresa Amabile.
Julia. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, sharing some insights from my 45 years of research on creativity. And let me give you my two aims for this session. One thing I'd like to do is share with you some discoveries that I think might be particularly interesting and useful to you as scholars and as individuals. Another thing I want to do is give you a bit of a glimpse into my own journey as a creativity researcher, including some of the twists and turns that I've had along the way during these 45 years. And I thought that that might be useful to the scholars, particularly young scholars in the group, but I hope it will be interesting to everyone in the audience. I'm going to start with a question for you, the audience, and I hope that you're going to be willing to participate with me. Will you just raise your hand if you feel that you were probably more creative as a child than you are now as an adult? Okay, I've never done this before. Could you put your hands up again? It looks to me like it's more than half the room feel that you were more creative as children. Okay, so among those who raise your hands, I wonder if anyone would be willing to tell us a little bit about why you think that you were more creative. If you were more creative as a kid, why do you think that might be? Yeah, go ahead. What's your name? Start out with your name, and if you would wait for a microphone, go ahead.
My name is Ljubcho, and I think that we were kind of shaped, by the society. Now we are behaving according to different norms, while then we were, just learning.
Okay, did you say you're graded according to different norms, or you're evaluated according to norms of society now?
Now we behave,
adults.
Yeah, as adults. Well, as children, we were free, to say,
Okay.
Thank you.
So not as free.
Yeah.
as in childhood. Great, thank you for that. So I'm just going to put in parentheses, evaluated by societal norms. Is that okay? Yeah. Behaving according to norms. Okay, thank you. Who else? Yeah, we'll get one here and then we'll go over to the other side of the room.
Hi, I'm Sue Dean.
Sue?
I went through a process of having where people encouraged me to be more serious. And being more serious meant doing what everybody had done. It's kind of funny because actually in my career I've gone from when I was a kid I was highly creative, then it sunk, and then now it's back up again as people are encouraging more creativity in my work.
So you said serious meant doing things like everybody else did them.
As things have always been done.
Okay.
Don't change anything. Don't think of new ways of doing anything.
Okay, encouraged to be serious. And is it okay, Sue, if I put down that equals conforming?
Yeah.
Sort of conforming to the way things have always been done. And that reminds me of the earlier response of now that we're adults, we're behaving more according to the norms that we've learned. Okay, let's get some other responses over here. Yes, tell us your name.
Hi, I'm Mi Zhang. I feel like I was less afraid of talking about my ideas when I was a child because I knew that my parents would love whatever I would say. So I could expect some positive feedback.
Okay, and can you give us the contrast? There's like a little bit of a but now that I'm an adult.
Well, I think people are more serious about my ideas. They are trying to give some nice feedback, but still it's kind of evaluative rather than, oh, everything you're doing is awesome.
Okay. So I'm going to say, Mi Jung, I'm going to say parents loved everything I did. Is that okay? Okay, parents loved all that I did. Let's get another one over here. Yes.
I just keep thinking of the word play, and that as kids, there's not an outcome that needs to happen. We're just playing. And so it's much easier to experiment when what you're doing is play.
Okay. So playing without outcome. Great. Let's see if we can get one or two more. Anybody else have something different from what we see up here so far? And could you yell out your name? The last person who spoke did not tell her name. Rena. Okay, thank you, Rena. Yes.
Hi, I'm Dave Shung. I think as a kid, I had more neurons than I do now and more neural connections. I think I have more outside concerns now, like showing up at 4 o'clock. I got to be here at 4 o'clock. Mm-hmm. And I also think that as a kid, each new experience is a bigger percentage of my life. You know, like when I was 5 years old, I had only 5 years of experiences. And so a new experience is a big chunk of that.
Yeah.
And now I'm 58, and a new experience is diluted by all of the other experiences.
Okay. Great. I love the more neurons. Let's just tell it like it is, huh, Dave? Anything else? Anything else that's occurred to anybody that we don't have up here yet? Yes.
Hi, my name is Yuna. I think as children, we have more free time and less responsibilities. So we don't have that list of I have to or I should. It's more I want to. So we explore all our wants, basically.
Okay, so free time without responsibilities. Right. No stress or lower stress. Although I know some kids who would argue with that, but yeah. So what you have just induced here, what your answers have told us actually fits into two of the three components of creativity. I'm going to label these, but I'll say a little bit more about the components in just a few minutes. So one component of creativity, one ingredient that people need inside their brains, inside their minds, in order to be creative, is experience, expertise, skills in some domain or other, and sometimes multiple domains. So this is expertise, or we could also call it domain skill. Okay, a second component, which I didn't hear coming up, it was a little bit implicit in a couple of the answers, was creative thinking skill. Ways of looking at things that are kind of unusual, taking new perspectives on things, being able to persevere on a problem until you come up with something different, being very exploratory. So that's not specific to a particular domain of endeavor. Creativity skills are skills that you can deploy across multiple domains. So we're going to call these creative thinking skills, or just creativity skills maybe. And the third component is the one, I'm actually glad that so much on that third component came out, because this is really the one that I've focused on for most of my research in my career. And this is really the social environment as it influences motivational state. So, social environment influencing motivation. And this, I would argue, is a crucial component of creativity, this motivational component, but it's often overlooked. It's something that I think we don't pay sufficient attention to. As scholars for a long time, we didn't pay much attention to the motivational part of creativity. I think a lot of scholars are looking at that and have looked at that over the last several years. But I think as teachers, as parents, as business managers, we don't pay sufficient attention to this one. So this is what a lot of what I'm going to be focusing on in my talk. This motivational component is beautifully illustrated by one of my very favorite quotes in creativity. This is from a person whom I had never heard of before I came across this really interesting interview with him in 1981. He's an American physicist. He's passed away now a few years ago. His name was Arthur Shavlov, and he was at Stanford. He got the Nobel Prize in 1981 for his work on lasers. And in this interview, the interviewer asked him what he thought made the difference between more creative and less creative scientists. And this is what he said: "The labor of love aspect is important. The most creative scientists are not the most talented, but the ones who are just impelled by curiosity. They've got to know what the answer is." I was blown away when I came across this quote for two reasons. One, it encapsulates what had become the central discovery of my research, and that is that intrinsic motivation, the motivation to do something for the love of it, drives creativity. The other reason I love this quote is that it articulates my own drive in studying creativity. And that is, when it comes to creativity, I feel that I've got to know what the answer is. So this has been a touchstone for me throughout my career, this idea of intrinsic motivation being central to creativity, and it really still in many ways animates my thinking about creativity and my research on it. Going back still to the beginning of my career and up to the present day, I owe a debt of gratitude to many, many collaborators, co-authors, and intellectual partners, intellectual stimulants who have been important on my research journey. And I hope that you'll join me in a moment of silent appreciation as I show you the names. And many, many more. I wonder if it would be possible for someone who's a technology wizard to come down here and get the image of the slides up on the screen, because what I'm seeing is actually myself. I'd rather see the slides a little bit up close. So I began thinking about creativity due to a very memorable incident when I was 5 years old. I'm not going to have time to tell you that story, but if you're interested, you can hang around and I'll be happy to tell you the story informally after the session. I did start thinking about it when I was 5, but I didn't start formally researching creativity until I went to Stanford University as a doctoral student and was lucky enough to be working with Mark Lepper, who had then just published his initial study showing that working for reward can undermine children's intrinsic motivation. This was groundbreaking research at the time. I was fascinated by this result. And I started to wonder if working for reward might not only have a negative effect on subsequent intrinsic motivation to do something, but might it also have effects on immediate performance? And in particular, might it affect the creativity with which someone did whatever it was they were undertaking for reward? Reward and other kinds of extrinsic motivators or extrinsic constraints. And although I got some promising results from an initial study I did with children as the subjects, my dissertation advisors discouraged me from trying to follow this vision that I had developed of trying to build a social psychology of creativity. And that is trying to build a science of understanding how the social environment, factors in the social environment, might influence creativity. And in particular, I was interested in motivation as a mechanism, but I was interested in any social influences on creativity. Their argument went something like this. Creativity is dominated, and it was then in the 1970s and the decades before, had been dominated by an individual difference approach, where the orientation was, let's look at what distinguishes creative geniuses from all the rest of us in terms of their special characteristics and traits. No one was looking at influence of the social environment. And their second argument was, creativity research has a pretty poor reputation because much of it is methodologically weak. And you're going to be putting yourself into a field where you're already kind of starting below baseline in terms of the respect that your research will be accorded. And they did say, although we believe that you do really excellent research, we're really cautioning you out of this field. Like many doctoral students, I ignored my advisors. And really, like many advisors, they came around pretty quickly to being very supportive and very helpful in my early research. So one of the things that I had to do before I could undertake this program of research on creativity was figure out how to measure it, because you can't study something unless you can measure it. And I found that the ways of measuring creativity at the time weren't suitable for the research I wanted to do. Could you raise your hand if you've ever heard of the Torrance tests of creative thinking? Few people in the room have heard of them. These are paper and pencil tests. There's a battery of tests for children, a battery of tests for adults, and these are still used. For example, many schools will use versions of these tests to assess whether kids should go into programs for gifted and talented kids, for these special enrichment programs. Those were not suitable for me because they depend very heavily on special skills that some people have developed more than others. You know, that's one of the components of skill that you've developed, like drawing skill. One of the TT-CT tasks, for example, is here's a page of circles. See how many things you can draw, how many different things you can draw from these circles. And there are scoring systems for these things. I also felt that it was a pretty impoverished way of looking at creativity. So I preferred to actually have people make things, have them make products, write something or make an artwork that didn't depend strongly on, say, drawing skills or having a lot of fancy vocabulary, but that most people could do, but in which I could find a range of variability. Because I thought that the effects of the social environment might be fairly subtle, and I wanted them not to be swamped by enormous individual differences in skill. So I created a way of having people make products in the laboratory, because I did start with laboratory experiments, and then having those products rated on creativity by judges who knew something about the domain in which these products were made. So this was my conceptual definition of creativity. Creativity is a novel and appropriate response to an open-ended task. It has to be different from what's been done before, but it has to somehow be fitting to the goal of the task or the goal of the activity. The operational definition, that is, how do we know how creative something is really something is creative to the extent that independent judges agree that it is creative. So we ask people, say it's children's artwork that we're having judged. This is not an example of a task I've used. These are just cute kid drawings, one of which was made by my granddaughter. But, you know, maybe you'd have artists judge these or teachers of children who are very familiar with children's art. And those would be appropriate judges, and just have them rated relative to one another on creativity on a numerical scale. So that's what I call the consensual assessment technique, and it's pretty simple. And that's really the approach to measurement that I've used in essentially all of my creativity research. So now that I had my method for assessing creativity, I was able to start doing my studies that attacked the big question that I had. And that is looking at creativity as an outcome. How does the social environment influence creativity? So I'm going to give you as an illustration, an example, the very first study that I did in creativity. I did this with children who lived in my apartment complex in Palo Alto, California. And I call it the Art Party Study, looking at the effects of competitive reward on children's artistic creativity. So I invited all the kids in the apartment complex to come to an art party, and they randomly got either the Saturday invitation or the Sunday invitation. Both of these were done on the same weekend in the little community center that we had in the middle of the apartment complex. And it just said, come, and we'll have a couple of hours of fun activities and some snacks, and we think you'll enjoy it. And a lot of kids came, approximately equal numbers the 2 days. Both parties, we had a bunch of stuff going on, but we ended with the key activity, my creativity measure, and that was to make a paper collage. So this doesn't depend on skills that are any more complicated than being able to take colored pieces of paper and glue them onto a white poster board after you figure out how you want them to look on the poster board. So every kid got an identical set of materials in each of these art parties for this collage activity, And this was after they had done a bunch of other art activities, so they thought that this was just the last art activity they were doing. Everybody had an identical set of colored papers and glue and white poster board. And I told them, you'll have a little while to make a collage and use these materials in any way you want to make a collage that looks silly, that would make you or somebody else looking at it feel kind of silly. On Saturday, the first art party, we said, before they started on their collages, we said, oh, and after you finish this last art activity, we're going to have a raffle for 3 toys. And you've all got a number on your name tag, and we've got all those numbers here in this bowl, and we're going to have some kid come up here, we're going to blindfold them and have them pick out 3 numbers. And those kids are going to get their choice of these toys. And the Sunday party, exactly the same. We had the same 3 toys, but we said, and at the end of the collage making, my helpers and I said this, my helpers and I, who were 2 of my sisters who were then living in Palo Alto, my helpers and I are going to judge the collages. We're going to have a contest, and the best one is going to pick, the kid who made the best one is going to get to pick one of these 3 toys, and the second best will get their choice of the remaining 2 toys, and the third best will get the 3rd toy. So everything was the same, except that they believed they were competing for rewards. So there was an element of evaluation, an element of competition, and an element of reward, of course, and also some surveillance, because we walked around and we watched them while they were making their collages on the second day. The toys are supposed to be showing up on the bottom, but I obviously messed up my animation. You'll see the toys, I think, before I get off the slide. And then later we did judge I had artists judge the collage. Oh, by the way, in the second day, my sisters and I looked at the collages while the kids were having their snack, and then we said, oh my gosh, these are all so good. We can't decide. We're going to have a raffle. So we actually did have a raffle both days, but you know, the kids, while they were making the collages, thought they were competing with each other. And later on, I hired doctoral students or master's students from the Master of Fine Arts program at Stanford to come in one at a time, independently, to look at these collages that the kids had made and rate them using their own subjective sense of how creative these things were. And they knew they had been made by kids, but that's all they knew. And of course, we intermixed the collages from the 2 different days. And we found that the Saturday collages, that is the no competitive reward kids, made collages that were more creative, significantly more creative than those made by the kids who believed that they were competing for rewards. There are 2 of our prizes. And here are some kid collages I found on the internet. I no longer have images, or I can no longer find images of the collages from that study that was done in, I think, 1974 or 75. So that was exciting that I actually found this result, that these extrinsic motivators did have a dampening effect on kids' creativity. And I did a series of experiments using not this simple, this was a very simple 2-condition experiment, not this simple, but using a similar kind of paradigm with kids and with adults over the subsequent several years, with a number of different doctoral students of mine and collaborators. And this led to me basically discovering 6 reliable methods for killing creativity. It's not really what I had in mind back in grad school, but that's kind of how it worked out. So this is how to kill creativity. You might want to take notes in case you're interested in that. Expected evaluation can lead to lower creativity. Surveillance, being watched while you're working, can dampen creativity. Contracted for reward. And this is Anne Sexton, the poet Anne Sexton, who once wrote to her agent who had written to her saying, hey, I think I can get this kind of a deal for your next book contract. This was after she was pretty well known as a poet. This royalty rate for domestic sales, this royalty rate for international sales, and then, in subsequent years it would be this. And she wrote back to him saying, I hired you to deal with all of this. I want you to make these decisions that what you judge will be in my best interest. And then she said something really interesting. I am in love with money, so don't be mistaken. But first, I want to write good poems. After that, I'm anxious as hell to make money and fame and bring the stars all down. So notice what she's doing. She's saying, I like this extrinsic motivator, this money, but I'm trying to cognitively keep it distant from me while I'm doing my creative work. Because I know if I don't, it's going to lead to less good poems. So she seemed to understand this possible dampening effect. Constraint in how to do a task, competition with peers, and simply focusing on extrinsic motivators like power and money and fame. Simply thinking about those things and how much you'd like to get them can lead people to, at least temporarily, be less creative in what they do. Putting all this together, we essentially found that extrinsic motivators and extrinsic constraints of many different kinds can undermine creativity by undermining intrinsic motivation. And we did have intrinsic motivation measures in all or most of these studies. And that led to the articulation of the intrinsic motivation principle of creativity. And that is that people will be most creative when they're motivated primarily by the interest, enjoyment, satisfaction, and challenge, personal sense of challenge of the work itself, and not by extrinsic pressures or extrinsic motivators. This led to a theory of creativity, a model of creativity that I call, to my everlasting regret, the componential model of creativity. It just sounds kind of dull and boring. It doesn't highlight what I think is most interesting about the theory, and that is that it includes motivation. No prior theories of creativity included motivation, let alone intrinsic motivation. That was what I had focused on studying. So, of course, that had to be in the model as one of the key components of creativity. So not just task motivation, but specifically intrinsic motivation for the task. Expertise is another component that obviously is important, and creativity skills, obviously also important in creativity. That's not what I was interested in studying, but I knew that it wasn't just about motivation. And in fact, I think that these skill components probably carry more weight in how creative someone will be in a particular domain. That is, they account for more variance, probably. But to me, it's not the interesting variance. In part, I'm interested in motivation because it has been so neglected in creativity. But also, I'm interested in it because I have found in this research that it's very easy to change someone's motivational state toward a task by even momentary things that you do. I mean, that manipulation of getting people to think about the extrinsic reasons for doing what they do, that was a 5-minute manipulation. And it had a significant impact, and the subjects were not just ordinary adults, they were creative writers. They were people who spent at least 30 hours a week working in poetry or fiction or nonfiction writing or playwriting. And even they, the measures of creativity that we got from them in the lab, their creativity was dampened from the pre-measure we got to the post-measure. And that's pretty astonishing and scary, I think. But it shows the power of the social environment to influence creativity by influencing motivational state. So the unseen component there, these are the 3 components inside the individual. The unseen component is the social environment, which influences all of these components, but influences task motivation so strongly. So about the time that the theory was published, I realized that I had done all this research that resulted in knowing how to kill creativity. And I was getting a little tired of that. But about that time, my dear colleague and friend, former doctoral student, but for many years now, dear friend, colleague, and frequent collaborator, Beth Hennessy, and I got a very unexpected result in a study that gave us a clue about how we might be able to do the opposite. And this is a study on reward and creativity. So we decided that we wanted to do a very simple 2x2 design study where we looked at whether or not the subjects made a contract with the experimenter to do the activity in order to get a reward. Because in the theory that we had developed, that was the only condition under which reward should have a negative effect on creativity, if you see yourself as doing it in order to get that reward. Only under those conditions should intrinsic motivation and creativity be dampened. And we wanted to compare that with a condition in which people got a reward but weren't actually asked, will you do this in order to get the reward? So we crossed reward with choice. And we did these, this is Beth, we did these studies with both adults and children. So this was a multiple study paper because the results were so surprising. What are the effects of contracted for reward versus unexpected reward on creativity? And it was an experiment where we had people come into the lab, whether they were kids or adults, and do one activity. They thought that that was the reason that they were coming into the lab room. That was just kind of a bogus activity that we used as a way of getting them to think that they had fulfilled the reason they had come to the lab. And then something went wrong with that first activity. We couldn't continue it because the technology broke or whatever. So we said, look, we've got this other thing, this other activity for a different experiment. And we told some of them, you can, if it was a kid, you can go back to your classroom now if you want to, or you can do this other thing. So that was the choice or no choice. And for the adults, we said, you fulfilled your obligation for coming into the lab. You can leave now if you want, or, since we had only spent 5 minutes of the hour they expected to be there, we said, or if you want, you can do this other activity, and it'll take the same amount of time that the other one would have. Some people actually did decline, so we know that it really felt like a real choice. And here's the crucial thing. We said to some of them, we're paying people in this second activity, this second experiment. Or for the little kids, we said, the people who do this are getting a reward. And we told them what the reward was. So in the choice condition, they were choosing to do the activity that they knew would get this reward for them. And in the other condition, in the no choice condition, we said, oh, that's broken, you can't do that. We're going to have you switch to this instead. We're also doing this experiment. So we gave them no choice and said, you're doing this, and when you finish it, this is what you get because we're giving everybody in this experiment this. Okay, got it? And so we expected that of the 4 conditions, the only one that would show depressed level of intrinsic motivation and creativity would be the chosen reward, so the reward choice condition. And we did find that was clearly, significantly, the lowest level of creativity. But here was a surprise. We found that the no choice reward condition was the highest in creativity for both the kids and the adults. It was significantly higher in creativity than the control conditions. So wasn't this surprising? We didn't know how to think about this. It meant that rewards could, under some conditions, enhance intrinsic motivation and creativity. At least it looked that way. This was a little disconcerting because it meant that part of my theory was wrong, or at least not completely right. And notice, it wasn't just a little thing in the theory. It was like the cornerstone of the theory. So that was a little disconcerting, but it was also kind of exciting because it told us maybe there are ways that we can use social factors in the social environment to enhance creativity. Maybe we can actually figure out a way to use rewards to enhance creativity, but we have to figure out how to do this. What are the conditions under which we might be able to do this? So we started reasoning from a biological analogy. We thought about immunization. So if you think of extrinsic motivators, like promised reward being dangled in front of somebody for doing something, you think of that as maybe a toxin or a germ that can hurt intrinsic motivation and creativity. Maybe we could immunize children against that, and maybe even somehow lead to a situation where extrinsic motivation could add synergistically to intrinsic motivation and thus enhance creativity. So we thought, all right, let's try to do two things. Let's see if we can, first of all, strengthen children's intrinsic motivation for learning and doing things in school. And second, let's see if we can give them like a weak dose of extrinsic motivation, expose them to a weak dose of it, and also give them antibodies for it. This was, we tried to go from the biological to the psychological. So we thought we figured out a way to do this using video stimuli with children in small groups. So this was the immunization study, and Beth then did a conceptual replication of this study with one of her students and found essentially the same results. So the question was whether we could immunize kids against the negative effects of reward on their creativity. So before we had kids go into the experiment, their teacher administered to them, this was a week or two before the experiment started, Susan Harder's test of, these were fourth graders or fifth graders. We had them fill out Susan Harder's very simple survey for kids to assess their intrinsic motivation toward learning. Okay, so we would have a pre-measure of their intrinsic motivation toward doing different things in school. And we took that also as a post-measure after the experiment was all finished, okay? And it was, again, administered by the teachers. So for the kids, there was no connection in their mind between that and what the experimenters did with them in the experimental room. So there was an experimenter, a first experimenter, who in part one of the experiment did the immunization or the non-immunization with kids. And they were randomly assigned to condition. And she had them come into the lab room in small groups of 4 or 5 kids. And they watched a video in which we had 2 child actors interact with an adult, me, who was asking them about their feelings about school and the kinds of things that they did at school. And this was the immunization video. Tommy and Sarah, I'd really like to hear from each of you. What do you enjoy learning most in school? What is it that you find the most fun about what you're learning in school? Tell me a little bit about it. And Tommy talked about really enjoying social science and getting to do projects and reports on really interesting things like how people live in different parts of the world and learning all the stuff that he had no idea about. And Sarah talked about how she loved astronomy. She loved learning about the constellations and how the stars appear to move and why they appear to move to us on Earth. And she's been going outside in the evenings with her father and showing him what she's been learning. So they talked about their work in very intrinsically motivated ways. And then after a little bit of that, the adult asked them, well, what about getting good grades for your schoolwork, or like getting rewards, money from your parents if you bring home a good report card, because I know some kids get that. And Tommy and Sarah said things like, well, sure, I want to get a good report card, but that's not the most important thing to me while I'm doing my schoolwork, while I'm in school or doing my homework. What's most important to me is that I'm learning all this cool new stuff. So that was the inoculation where they got a little bit of extrinsic motivation, but they were given a way of thinking about it. Yeah, it's there, but I'm cognitively distancing myself from it, sort of like Anne Sexton did as an adult, distance herself from it cognitively, or at least put it into a certain perspective. The kids who watched the control, and then the experimenter had the kids talk about this video. So tell us, everybody talk about what you enjoy most what you enjoy learning most in school and why. So they talked about this as a way of strengthening their own intrinsic motivation, making it more salient to them. And we engaged them in discussion that was ideally going to be something like the discussion that Tommy and Sarah had with this with the person, the adult in the video. The control video was the same adult talking to the same kids who were the same age as the subjects about favorite foods and favorite seasons of the year and that kind of thing. And then the kids in the group talked about their favorite foods and seasons of the year. Then part 2 of the experiment was to put them through the usual creativity killing paradigm that we had, where they came in, they were randomly assigned, kids from the immunization and the non-immunization group crossed with being in the reward condition or the no reward condition, promised reward versus no reward promised, okay? So we found, as we expected, that the non-immunized kids showed the usual decline in creativity in that reward condition. And their intrinsic motivation for learning in the post-test was unchanged. But the kids who got that immunization experience not only showed a significantly higher level of intrinsic motivation toward learning on the post-test that was given in their classroom, but under reward, they showed higher levels of creativity. So we actually were able to show that we could get extrinsic motivation to synergistically combine with intrinsic motivation and support creativity. So this led to a significant revision of that intrinsic motivation principle of creativity. Intrinsic motivation is important for creativity. And extrinsic motivation that leads people to feel controlled by that extrinsic motivator or extrinsic constraint can undermine intrinsic motivation and creativity. But extrinsic motivation that either allows the person to be more engaged or stay more engaged in something they were already intrinsically motivated to do, or confirms their competence, that kind of extrinsic reward can synergistically add to intrinsic motivation and creativity. And that revised intrinsic motivation principle, called motivational synergy, appears in a significant revision of my theory that came out 2 years ago. Mike Pratt at BC was my co-author on that. So around this time, actually at the time that this study was being done, I was already beginning to scratch an intellectual itch that I had developed a little bit earlier. And that was, I've got to get out of the laboratory. And even with the children, although we were doing the research in their school, it was a laboratory-like setting. I wanted to get out into the real world where people were trying to be creative for a living, to see if these things that I had decided to study in the laboratory, these creativity killers that I decided to study in the laboratory, did they make a difference for creativity out there in the real world? And I decided, because in my first incarnation I was a chemist, I decided that studying R&D scientists inside organizations would be a good place to start. This led me out of my laboratory method, my experimental method, which was very nauseating at first, but I ended up really loving the interview research and the survey research that I ended up doing. So with colleagues at the Center for Creative Leadership, I was able to do a number of interview studies, starting with R&D scientists and then moving to many other people in other functions, finding out about what in their experience stood out in their minds as highly creative projects that they had worked on recently. and describe what went on in those projects. Who was involved? What was the work environment like? So we asked very broadly, just tell us about those. And tell us about disappointing projects that should have been creative, but it didn't work out that way. The result was not creative, it was ordinary, didn't move things forward, it wasn't successful in your view, it wasn't creative. And we analyzed those interviews to look for social environmental factors, and they were there all over the place. And we actually saw many of the things that my team, my students and I had studied in the lab, but we also found things that we had never thought to study. After doing a number of those interview studies, I decided to find an easier way to assess the work environment for creativity, and then created a survey, which is called KEYS. And I'm going to just describe briefly one study that we did using KEYS that I think is our most important study of work environment factors that can influence creativity. So in the study, we want to see if the work environments of highly creative projects differ significantly from the work environments of low creativity projects in R&D. So we started by going to dozens of ongoing or just recently completed projects in this very large high-tech company. These were all projects that were supposed to be creating the new products of the company. They were supposed to be highly innovative, highly creative projects. And we assessed the work environments by having everyone on these project teams use KEYS to rate the work environment as they perceived it on this project that they were currently in. So we had those work environment measures, and then a little while afterwards, we had the projects rated on creativity and some other qualities like technical quality by a group of middle-level managers who are broadly familiar with a wide range of projects across this company. And we asked them to, essentially, we did the consensual assessment technique with them. Individually, we asked each of them to rate each of these projects on creativity. And then we looked at whether the work environments of the most highly creatively rated projects differed significantly from those that were in the bottom group of projects in terms of creativity. And we found many significant differences on a number of dimensions of the work environment. And these did, in many respects, replicate what we had found in the laboratory. So, for example, we found that the higher creativity projects, to the people who were working on them, while they were working on them, they felt like they were more positively challenging. And challenge is a key aspect of intrinsic motivation. We found that they felt that they had greater degrees of freedom, essentially more autonomy. And you remember, we studied constraint as an extrinsic motivator that undermined creativity in the laboratory. And we found that expected evaluation could undermine creativity. And here we found as an organizational impediment, being in an atmosphere where you were likely to get harsh evaluations of new ideas, that dampened creativity. But we found so many other things, like work group supports, a sense of trust and mutual receptiveness to new ideas, but at the same time a willingness to challenge each other's new ideas within a work group could really support creativity, an ability to communicate within a group. Supervisory supports, like being able to set clear goals, but allowing people the autonomy at the same time to decide how to achieve those goals, like serving as a good work model, like valuing individual contributions to team projects. Those kinds of supervisory supports were crucial to creativity. And organizational supports, organizational encouragement, like having a free flow of ideas within the organization, like having mechanisms for developing new ideas. And interestingly, having mechanisms by which creative ideas were recognized and rewarded, synergistic, extrinsic motivators. So all of those were creativity supports. This work, which was kind of looking at the work environment from a 30,000-foot view, We know that broadly these kinds of supports can make a difference in creativity. I was then itching to understand how this happened day by day. How is it that these positive and negative work environments arise in organizations? What is it that people say and do every day as coworkers, as team leaders, as organizational leaders that can influence each other's intrinsic motivation and creativity? This was such a big, ambitious project. I couldn't really undertake it until I went from Brandeis University Psychology Department to Harvard Business School in 1995. And at that point, I started designing what I call the diary study. And this was trying to understand how inner work life, that is, day by day emotions, perceptions, and motivations, how that influences creativity. We're expecting to find that intrinsic motivation would positively influence creativity, but we wanted to know not only about that, but we wanted to study emotion as well. We wanted to study perceptions of the environment day by day. And we wanted to find out how things that happened during the workday influenced these psychological experiences. So we wanted to get samples of events that were occurring at work in as close to real time as we could. So we asked 238 professionals working on creative projects, and that means projects that were supposed to be creative. We asked them to fill out daily diaries for us during the entire course of a project that they were doing in their company. Up to 9 months, some of these projects were. The average project was 4.5 months. Monday through Friday, they filled out diaries for us with a 75% response rate. And if you want to know how we achieved that 75% response rate, I could tell you about that afterwards too. So we got these diaries that had daily scale ratings, quantitative measures of emotions, perceptions, motivations, and also had a story from the day. We asked everybody write for us briefly describe one event that occurred today that stands out in your mind. It can be anything at all, as long as it's relevant to your work or this project. And we spent years analyzing these nearly 12,000 diaries that we got. And we also got separate performance ratings of the people in this study. So we were able to look at their creativity, their productivity, their contributions to team cohesion, and so on. And I'm just going to tell you about 2 results here. We found that positive emotion positively predicts creativity, not only on the day that the emotion is experienced, but even the next day, regardless of the person's mood the next day. And second finding was that specific things that team leaders do day by day make a difference for perceived team leader support, and team leader support significantly predicts creativity. To me, the most important finding of all of this is what we call the progress principle, and that came out in a book that I wrote with Stephen Kramer, who is also my husband. Of all the everyday work events that can lead to positive inner work life, by far the most prominent is simply making progress in meaningful work. I have a lot of detail on that, but I'm going to skip the detail because there are a couple more things I want to do. And one of those is to give you a little preview of the research we're currently doing on creativity and how it influences retirement. So notice, creativity is not an outcome here. I'm doing research with a wonderful team of collaborators right now, where we're looking at creativity among many other things. And our question is, how might involvement in creative activity at work and outside of work matter for people's life satisfaction in retirement? We have 120 people who have spent time letting us interview them, some of them multiple times. We've now got 200 interviews, and data collection is closed as of 3 months ago. Very much in progress, but one thing we have found is that life satisfaction in the early years of retirement relates significantly to the opportunity the person had for creative work while they were working. It does not relate to creative activity outside of work, which was very surprising to me. I thought it would be the opposite. Creativity at work is really important, even when you've left that work behind. And given how important creative work is, I think we need to spend much more time thinking about how we can support creative work for older employees and for people who are in retirement. So these are my takeaways for you. I'm not going to read them. I'm just going to show them because we're at the end of our time, but I have one more thing to say. We have, at the end of our very long interview in this retirement study, we have a question that asks, some people think about leaving a legacy through their life or their work. Is that something that you've thought about? Well, it's something that I've thought about. I'm now semi-retired, and I have thought about it. I don't believe that my theory is going to survive for very long unaltered, even if in its new and improved state, and we've now made a lot of revisions to it because we've seen a lot of things over the years that have taught us that the first theory wasn't quite right. And I think some of my empirical results are going to get upended too, but that's okay. That's the way it should be with science. And I think all of us who are studying creativity, and in fact, no matter what we're studying, we need to adopt an attitude of confident humility. That's how I think about it. We need to be confident enough to pursue something that we're passionately interested in, that we really want to find out about, regardless of whether other people think it's infeasible, as my doctoral advisors did initially. But we also have to be humble enough to realize that we're not going to get it right the first time. At least we're not going to get it completely right the first time. And maybe not even the second time. And we have to be willing to revise our own thinking and even revise things that we have put a stake in the ground on by publishing. And we need to be grateful when other people improve on our work and challenge our work. So I'm going to leave you with a question designed to hopefully have you tap into what your creative legacy might be through your life or your work. What might your labor of love be? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. All right. So we have a little tradition to give speakers a special artifact. Now maybe I should call it an unexpected bonus. It's a positive spiral for you, and thank you so much for sharing your insights with this audience. Could you please give her another round of applause? Thank you. Here you go. All right, I have one more announcement to make. We have Dr. Lisa Leslie coming to visit us on November 18th between 4 and 5, and she's going to talk about whether diversity initiatives are actually effective or not. So please stay tuned and please come back here in November. Thank you so much.
I'm going to take a really quick break, but then I will come back into this room in case anyone wants to chat with me informally.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.